He couldn't move, he couldn't speak, but inside that silent body, Alexander Kane was watching every single person who believed he was already gone. And on a warm Saturday evening inside a $12 million estate just outside Chicago, where crystal chandeliers reflected soft golden light across marble floors polished to perfection, the most powerful man in the room sat in a wheelchair no one respected anymore. His head slightly tilted, his hands resting lifelessly on his lap, eyes open but unreadable, like a statue placed there to remind guests of a legacy that had already ended. And they treated him exactly like that, like something expensive but no longer important, especially Victoria Hale, the woman who wore a $4,000 silk dress and a diamond ring he once placed on her finger with steady hands, back when his voice could command rooms and his presence could silence deals. But tonight she didn't even look at him, not once, as she walked past him with a glass of champagne in hand, laughing too loudly at something a man twice her age whispered in her ear, her heels clicking sharply against the marble as if each step declared that she had already moved on from the man sitting less than 10 feet away. And the guests noticed, of course they did, the sideways glances, the subtle smirks, the quiet assumptions forming in the air like smoke that no one bothered to clear, because in their world, power was everything. And a man who couldn't move was a man who no longer mattered. And Alexander heard it all, every careless whisper, every dismissive tone, every moment someone spoke about him as if he were no longer in the room. Because what they didn't know, what none of them even considered, was that behind those still eyes was a mind fully awake, fully aware, recording every detail with a patience far more dangerous than anger. And yet in the middle of all that indifference, one person moved differently, almost quietly enough to be ignored. Naomi Brooks, a black maid in a simple uniform that blended into the background of wealth she didn't belong to, her footsteps soft, her movements careful, not rushed like the others who only served appearances, but deliberate, as if every small action carried weight. And when she approached Alexander, she didn't hesitate or look around for permission. She simply stepped closer, adjusted the collar of his shirt that had shifted slightly, wiped a faint line of moisture from the corner of his mouth with a clean cloth, and straightened his posture with a gentleness that didn't ask for recognition, her eyes steady, not pitying, not distant, just present, as if she understood something the others refused to see. And for a brief moment, something almost imperceptible changed in the air around him, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet shift, like dignity returning to a place that had forgotten what it felt like. While across the room Victoria raised her glass again, already laughing, already planning a future that no longer included the man who had built everything she stood in. And still, Alexander watched, silent, patient, remembering everything. Because in a world where everyone believed he had lost his power, they had no idea that this silence was not weakness, it was judgment waiting for the right moment to speak. The laughter in the room did not fade. It only shifted, rising and falling in careless waves as conversations turned sharper, more personal, and far more revealing than anyone intended. Because once people believed a man could no longer respond, they stopped choosing their words carefully. And Victoria stood at the center of it all, her voice smooth and effortless as she leaned against the edge of a polished oak table, casually swirling the pale gold liquid in her glass while speaking to two investors who had once waited weeks for a meeting with Alexander Kane. And now they listened to her instead, nodding as if she had already inherited everything that mattered. The doctors say there is no real change, she said with a small shrug, her tone almost bored, as if she were discussing a delayed shipment rather than the man who had built the empire around them. At this point, it is more about maintaining comfort than expecting anything meaningful. And one of the men gave a sympathetic smile that did not quite reach his eyes, glancing briefly toward Alexander before lowering his voice. That must be difficult for you. And she let out a soft laugh, light and controlled. You learn to adapt, she replied, though her gaze never once turned in his direction, not even out of obligation. And across the room, Naomi heard every word as she stood near the long dining table, carefully adjusting silverware that had already been perfectly aligned, her hand steady but her jaw tightening ever so slightly. Because she had seen this before, not in mansions or among people dressed in designer suits, but in smaller rooms, quieter places, where illness made others uncomfortable and distance became easier than compassion, and still she said nothing, because her role was not to correct them, it was to remain invisible, and yet invisibility did not mean indifference, not to her, not when she turned and walked back toward Alexander, her steps measured, her presence calm in contrast to the restless energy filling the room. And when she reached him, she paused for just a second, as if acknowledging him in a way no one else had all night, before gently placing her hand on the back of his chair and adjusting its position by a few inches so he faced the window where the last traces of sunset painted the sky in deep orange and fading blue, a small act, almost unnoticeable, but intentional. And then she leaned in slightly, her voice low and steady, speaking as if he could hear every word. "It is quieter over here, Mr. Kane," she said, not expecting an answer, not needing one. Because to her, silence was not absence, it was simply another form of listening. And behind her, Victoria's laughter rose again, louder this time, drawing attention as she made a comment that caused a ripple of amusement among the guests, something about moving forward, about knowing when to let go, words that floated through the air with a sharpness disguised as elegance. And still, Alexander remained still, his expression unchanged, his body unmoving. But inside, something was shifting, not anger, not yet, but clarity, a slow and undeniable recognition of who stood where when it mattered, who spoke when they thought he could not hear, and who chose kindness without an audience. And as Naomi straightened his sleeve once more, smoothing out a barely visible crease with careful precision, the contrast in the room became impossible to ignore, not because anyone pointed it out, but because it existed so plainly in front of them. One woman erasing him piece by piece with every careless word, and another quietly restoring what little dignity the world had tried to take away. And though no one said it out loud, though no one paused the music or silenced the conversations, something deeper had already begun to take shape, something patient, something watching, something that would not stay hidden forever. The music softened as the evening stretched deeper into night, but the distance between people in the room only grew sharper, more defined, as if invisible lines had been drawn that no one dared to cross. And near the tall glass windows where the last glow of daylight had faded into reflections of artificial light, Naomi remained beside Alexander with a quiet consistency that did not seek attention, yet could not be ignored by anyone who truly looked. And though most guests continued their conversations, a few began to notice the pattern, the way she returned every few minutes, not out of obligation but intention, adjusting the angle of his chair so he was never left staring at a blank wall, making sure his water glass was within reach even if he could not lift it, smoothing the fabric of his sleeve as if presentation still mattered, because to her it did. And in those small gestures, there was something unfamiliar in that house, something that did not belong to wealth or status, but to something far more human. And eventually one of the younger guests, a man who had been watching from a distance with mild curiosity, leaned toward another and whispered just loud enough to be heard, "Does she really think he notices any of that?" And the response came with a quiet chuckle. "It probably makes her feel better," as if kindness required an audience to have value. And Naomi heard it. Of course she did. But she did not turn, did not react, because her focus never left the man in front of her, and instead she leaned slightly closer again, lowering her voice into a calm, steady tone that carried no trace of performance. "You used to host these gatherings every spring, did you not?" she said softly, her words measured as if continuing a conversation no one else could hear. "I read about it in one of the old articles in your study. Said people would wait months just to be invited." And for a moment she paused, her eyes studying his face not for movement, but for presence, as if she believed something inside him still responded, even if the world refused to see it. "It is still your house," she added gently. "They just forgot how to act like it." And behind her, Victoria's voice cut through the room again, sharper now, edged with impatience as she spoke with a lawyer near the bar, her tone no longer light but calculated. "We need to move things forward sooner rather than later," she said, tapping her fingers lightly against the glass in her hand. "The longer this situation drags out, the more complicated everything becomes." And the lawyer nodded, cautiously, lowering his voice, but not enough to keep it from traveling across the polished surfaces of the room. There are procedures, legal reviews, medical confirmations. And she exhaled, clearly irritated. He is not coming back, she said plainly, the words landing heavier than she intended. Because this time, even those pretending not to listen felt the shift, a subtle tightening in the air, as if something had been said too openly, too definitively. And still, across the room, Naomi continued as if none of it had happened, her hand resting briefly on the arm of Alexander's chair, steady and grounding. Some people only show who they are when they think no one is watching, she said quietly, her gaze soft but unwavering. And for just a fraction of a second, something so slight it could have been dismissed as imagination flickered beneath Alexander's stillness, a tension in his fingers, a nearly invisible shift. Not enough for the room to notice, not enough for Victoria to care, but enough for something deeper to register, something patient and waiting, something that had been collecting every word, every glance, every choice made in this house. And as Naomi straightened once more, her expression calm, her movements unhurried, the contrast between silence and noise, between dignity and dismissal, became impossible to ignore for anyone willing to truly see it. And yet most still chose not to, because acknowledging it would mean confronting something far more uncomfortable than a man in a wheelchair. It would mean confronting themselves. The evening did not slow down. It sharpened, as conversations began to separate into quieter corners where intentions were no longer hidden behind polite smiles. And near the far side of the room, just beyond the soft glow of a standing lamp, Victoria stood with the estate's legal advisor, her posture straighter now, her tone lower but far more deliberate, as if she had finally reached the part of the night she had been waiting for. "I need clarity," she said, her voice controlled, each word placed carefully. "If his condition remains unchanged, there has to be a point where decisions can be made without delay." And the lawyer adjusted his glasses, glancing briefly across the room toward Alexander before responding with professional caution. "There are evaluations required, documented observations, time frames that cannot simply be bypassed." And she exhaled slowly, not frustrated in appearance, but in patience. "Time is exactly what we do not have if the estate is going to remain stable," she replied, her fingers tapping lightly against the side of her glass again, a subtle rhythm that betrayed the urgency beneath her composed exterior. And though she kept her voice low, the words carried just enough to reach the edges of the room where attention had begun to drift, not out of curiosity but instinct, because something about the conversation felt less like concern and more like positioning. And across that same space, Naomi stood quietly beside Alexander once more, her presence steady in contrast to the shifting energy around them. And this time she did not adjust anything immediately. She simply stood there for a moment, looking at him as if measuring something deeper than appearances, before speaking again in that same calm tone that never tried to demand a response. "They are talking about your future. Like it is already decided," she said softly, her words gentle but grounded in truth. "Like you are not here to hear it." And she paused, not for effect, but because she respected silence as part of the conversation. "But I do not believe that," she added, almost as if reminding herself as much as him. And slowly she reached down and adjusted the cuff of his shirt once more, smoothing the fabric with careful precision, then placing his hand slightly differently on his lap so it looked less like it had been left there and more like it belonged there, a small shift that changed everything about how he was seen, even if no one else acknowledged it. And in the reflection of the window beside them, the entire room could be seen at once, the laughter, the calculated conversations, the subtle exchanges of power happening in plain sight. And within that reflection, two truths existed at the same time, one loud and one quiet, one claiming control and the other preserving dignity. And as Naomi stepped back just slightly, giving him space without ever stepping away completely, something else moved beneath the surface of stillness, something restrained but undeniable, a tension building not in anger but in awareness, because every word spoken tonight, every glance avoided, every act of kindness offered without recognition was being gathered into something larger than the moment itself, something that would not remain silent forever. And across the room, Victoria's voice softened again, as she leaned closer to the lawyer, sealing her intentions behind a final measured statement. "We should begin preparing the paperwork," she said, her expression composed, her decision already made. And for the first time that night, the air did not just feel divided. It felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something no one could yet see but was already on its way. The room had begun to thin out as the night stretched past its peak, conversations softening into smaller clusters, while the echo of earlier laughter lingered faintly against the high ceilings. And yet the most important exchanges were no longer happening in the center of the gathering, but in the quiet edges where decisions were made without witnesses. And in one of those corners, Victoria stood again with the lawyer, this time holding a slim folder that had not been there before, its contents neatly arranged, deliberate, prepared in advance. And though her expression remained composed, there was a subtle shift in her posture, a confidence that came not from uncertainty, but from conclusion, as if she had already crossed a line no one else knew existed. "Everything is in order," she said calmly, flipping a single page with precise movement. Medical reports, evaluations, statements of condition, all consistent. And the lawyer hesitated for just a fraction of a second before responding, his voice careful. "There are still formalities, Ms. Hale, including confirmation of cognitive state." And she gave a small, almost dismissive smile. "You have seen him," she replied, her tone lowering. "Everyone here has seen him." And for a moment, the weight of that assumption hung in the air, not challenged, not questioned, simply accepted by those who preferred certainty over doubt. And across the room, Naomi noticed the folder before she heard the words, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in suspicion but in understanding, because she had learned long ago that decisions like these did not happen suddenly. They were built quietly over time, piece by piece, just like everything else in that house. And as she turned back toward Alexander, she did not rush, did not react outwardly, but there was a new steadiness in her movements, something firmer, more grounded, as if she recognized that what was unfolding was no longer just indifference, but something final. And she stepped closer again, her voice low but clearer now. "They are writing your future without asking you," she said, each word deliberate, not emotional, not pleading, simply true. And she paused, letting the silence between them hold the meaning. "But I have seen enough to know you are still here," she added, her hand resting briefly against the arm of his chair, not to move it this time, but to anchor the moment. And for the first time that night, something deeper stirred beneath the stillness, not visible to the room, not obvious, even to her, but present, a tension that did not belong to absence but to restraint, as if something within him was pressing against an invisible boundary, waiting, measuring, choosing the exact moment it would no longer remain contained. And in the reflection of the darkened window beside them, the contrast sharpened once again. Victoria standing under bright light with polished certainty, holding documents that assumed silence, while Naomi stood in the quiet, offering something that required no proof, no signature, no validation, only recognition. And as the lawyer finally nodded, closing the folder with a soft but definitive motion, the sound carried farther than expected, cutting through the low hum of conversation just enough to draw a few glances, just enough to signal that something had shifted beyond casual discussion. And Victoria's expression did not change as she took the folder back, her grip steady, her decision complete, because in her mind, the outcome was already decided, already secured, already hers. And yet across the room, in the space she no longer considered relevant, the man she had dismissed remained exactly where he had been all night, silent, still, watching, and remembering everything. The night had reached that quiet turning point where the music no longer mattered and the conversations became heavier, more deliberate, as if everyone remaining understood that what was left unsaid carried more weight than anything spoken aloud. And one by one the guests began to drift farther apart, some toward the exits, others toward private corners where deals could be whispered without interruption, leaving behind a thinner, sharper atmosphere that no longer hid its intentions behind polite laughter. And in that shifting silence, the staff began their quiet rhythm of restoration, collecting empty glasses, straightening chairs, erasing the visible traces of a night that had revealed far more than it should have. And Naomi moved among them for a moment, her steps calm but purposeful, before returning once again to Alexander, because even as the room changed, her focus never did, and when she reached him this time, she paused longer than before, studying his face not for signs of movement, but for something deeper, something that did not rely on physical response. And then she spoke again, her voice steady, carrying no urgency yet filled with quiet certainty. "They think silence means surrender," she said softly, her eyes never leaving his. "But I have seen people fight without saying a single word." And as she spoke, her hand rested briefly against his, not forcing, not testing, simply present, and for a moment that seemed to stretch beyond time. There was stillness, complete and uninterrupted, and then something so subtle it could have been dismissed by anyone not looking closely enough appeared. A faint tension beneath his fingers, not movement exactly, but resistance, like something pushing gently against stillness. And Naomi did not react outwardly, did not draw attention, but her breath slowed just slightly, her focus sharpening as if she had just been given confirmation of something she had already believed. And across the room, Victoria stood near the doorway now, her posture relaxed, her expression satisfied in a way that came from resolution rather than relief. The folder no longer in her hand because it had already been handed off, already set into motion, and she glanced briefly in Alexander's direction, not with concern or even curiosity, but with the distant acknowledgement one might give to something that no longer required attention. And then she turned away again, continuing her conversation, as if the chapter had already closed, and yet behind her, unseen and unacknowledged, something had begun to shift in a way she could not predict. Because while she had secured documents and signatures and expectations, she had overlooked something far less visible and far more dangerous: awareness. And back near the window, where reflections blurred the boundary between what was seen and what was hidden, Naomi leaned slightly closer once more, her voice softer now, almost like a quiet promise. "You are not alone in this room," she said, and for the first time, the silence did not feel empty. It felt full, charged with something waiting just beneath the surface, something that had listened to every word, measured every intention, and chosen patience over reaction. And as the final few guests made their way out and the large doors closed with a soft but definitive sound that echoed briefly through the hall, the house fell into a different kind of quiet, not the absence of noise, but the presence of something unresolved, something that had not yet revealed itself, but no longer intended to remain hidden for long. The house settled into a silence that felt heavier than noise, the kind that lingered after doors closed and footsteps faded, leaving behind only the quiet hum of distant air vents and the faint ticking of a wall clock that suddenly seemed louder than it should have been. And in that stillness, the illusion that had carried the entire evening began to thin, revealing something far more precise beneath it. Because away from the crowd and the performance, truth no longer needed to hide behind polite behavior, and Naomi remained where she had been, beside Alexander, not out of duty but choice, her presence steady as the last of the staff moved quietly through the far halls, finishing their tasks. And when the room was finally empty, completely empty, she exhaled softly and stepped around to face him directly, no longer adjusting details for appearance, no longer maintaining the role expected of her, but simply standing there as one person acknowledging another. And for a moment she said nothing at all, allowing the silence to exist without interruption, before speaking again in a tone that carried no hesitation. "They are gone now," she said gently, her voice clear in the quiet space. No more pretending, no more watching from across the room. And her eyes remained fixed on his, not searching for movement, but recognizing presence. And then slowly, without any sudden motion, she reached down and placed her hand lightly over his, not to test him, not to prove anything, but to connect. And this time the stillness did not hold the same emptiness it once had, because beneath her touch, there was something unmistakable, a faint but deliberate resistance, not imagined, not accidental, but real. And Naomi did not pull away, did not react with surprise, because she had already believed this moment would come. She had simply been waiting for it to reveal itself, and her voice lowered just slightly, carrying a quiet certainty that had been building all night. "You have been listening," she said, not as a question, but as a truth finally spoken aloud. And in that instant, something shifted in a way that could no longer be denied, not to her, not to him. Because while the world had chosen to see absence, she had chosen to see possibility, and now that possibility had answered, not with words, but with presence, and across the hall, unseen and forgotten by everyone who had left, a small red light blinked steadily from a security camera mounted high in the corner, capturing everything without judgment, without interruption, recording every moment of the night from the first careless laugh to the final quiet truth. And within that silent witness lay something far more powerful than assumptions or documents, because unlike people, it did not decide what mattered. It simply remembered. And as Naomi remained beside him, her hand still resting gently over his, the space between silence and revelation grew thinner, more fragile, as if the entire house itself was holding its breath, waiting for the moment when what had been hidden would finally step into the light. And though nothing dramatic had happened, no voice raised, no sudden movement breaking the stillness, something undeniable had begun, something that would not be undone by signatures or decisions made in whispered corners. Because for the first time that night, the truth was no longer one-sided. It was shared, and it was awake. Morning did not arrive with noise but with clarity, a quiet light stretching across the wide windows of the estate, revealing every detail the night had tried to soften. And in that early stillness, the house no longer felt like a stage. It felt like a place where something unfinished had finally reached its moment. And Naomi was already there, standing near Alexander with the same calm presence she had carried through the night, as if time had not passed for her at all. And when the first rays of sunlight touched his face, something changed, not dramatically, not suddenly, but undeniably, because this time when she reached for his hand, the response was not subtle, it was intentional, his fingers tightening around hers with a strength that no longer hid itself. And for a brief second, even she paused, not out of doubt but out of recognition, because belief had turned into proof. And then, slowly, Alexander moved, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that made silence impossible, his shoulders shifting, his head lifting, just slightly. And when his eyes met hers, there was no emptiness left in them, only awareness, sharp and fully present, as if everything he had held back was now standing at the surface. And Naomi did not step away, did not react with fear or surprise. She simply met that moment with the same steadiness she had offered when the world refused to see him. And for a few seconds, neither of them spoke, because words were not needed to confirm what had already been understood. And then, across the hall, the sound of footsteps broke the stillness, measured and approaching, as the lawyer returned earlier than expected, holding the same folder that had been passed around the night before, his expression focused, unaware that the assumptions he carried were already outdated. And behind him, Victoria followed, her posture composed, her confidence intact, expecting closure, expecting control, expecting the final step in a process she believed had already been secured. And as they entered the room, their attention moved immediately toward Alexander, but not with curiosity, with conclusion, until something stopped them, not a sound, not a gesture, but a presence that no longer matched what they had accepted, because he was no longer still in the same way, no longer distant, no longer absent. And as the lawyer slowed, his steps faltering just slightly, Alexander's hand remained firmly around Naomi's, a detail small enough to be missed but impossible to ignore once seen. And Victoria's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough to reveal the crack beneath her certainty, her eyes narrowing as if trying to reconcile what stood in front of her with what she had already decided was true. And in that moment, the entire room changed, not because of what was said, but because of what could no longer be denied. And the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was heavy, filled with realization, filled with consequence, filled with the quiet collapse of every assumption that had been made in that house. And as Alexander's gaze moved from Naomi to the two figures standing across from him, steady and unwavering, the truth did not need to be spoken aloud to be understood. It was already there, already present, already impossible to erase. And the room, once filled with voices that dismissed him, now held nothing but silence. No one spoke at first, because the moment did not allow it, the kind of silence that does not ask for words but demands understanding. and Alexander Kane remained exactly where he was, seated yet no longer diminished, his hand still holding Naomi's with a quiet certainty that carried more authority than any command he had ever given. And when he finally shifted his gaze fully toward Victoria, it was not with anger, not with accusation, but with something far more unsettling, clarity, the kind that leaves no room for denial. And the lawyer was the first to react, his composure slipping just enough for professionalism to turn into uncertainty. "Mr. Kane," he said carefully, his voice no longer confident but cautious, as if stepping into unfamiliar ground, and Alexander did not rush to answer, did not rise, did not need to prove anything beyond what was already visible, because the truth had already dismantled every assumption in the room. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, and unmistakably present. "I have been here the entire time," he said, each word steady, not raised, not forced, but carrying the weight of everything he had witnessed, and the effect was immediate, not dramatic but absolute, as if the air itself shifted to accommodate a reality no one had prepared for, and Victoria's expression tightened, her composure holding but no longer effortless, because this was not a scenario she had planned for, not a possibility she had accounted for, and, for a brief second, she searched for control, for something to say that would restore her position, but nothing came, because there was nothing left to assume, nothing left to reinterpret, only what had been done and what had been heard, and Alexander's gaze did not leave her as he continued, still calm, still precise. "Every conversation, every decision, every word spoken when you believed I could not hear," he said, not accusing, simply stating. And the room seemed to shrink under the weight of it, the polished surfaces, the carefully arranged furniture, all of it suddenly insignificant compared to the truth standing in the center of it. And then, without raising his voice, without changing his tone, he made the only decision that mattered. "The paperwork will not proceed," he said, his words final not because of volume, but because of certainty, and the lawyer nodded almost instinctively, as if recognizing authority without needing to question it, while Victoria stood still, her silence no longer chosen but imposed, because, for the first time, she was no longer directing the outcome, she was part of it, and slowly, Alexander turned his attention away from her, not dramatically, not with dismissal, but with a quiet finality that carried more meaning than confrontation ever could, and instead he looked at Naomi, the one person who had spoken to him as if he mattered when no one else did, the one person who had never waited for proof to offer respect, and there was no grand gesture, no declaration, just a simple, unmistakable acknowledgement in his eyes, the kind that could not be written into contracts or transferred through power, only earned through presence. And as the morning light filled the room completely, removing every shadow that had hidden the truth the night before, the difference between them all became undeniable, not in status, not in wealth, but in something far more lasting. And as the silence settled once more, no longer heavy but resolved, the house itself seemed to hold that moment, as if remembering it, and on that day, without announcement, without spectacle, the balance of power did not just shift, it corrected itself, quietly, completely, and without apology.